You are 41 years old, standing in a driveway, watching a tow truck hook up to the car you bought 18 months ago. Your neighbor is pretending not to watch from his kitchen window. 9 years earlier, you were the one everyone in the office wanted to be. You were bringing home $82,000 a year and climbing fast. Ryan, 2 desks over, was still making $61,000. Today, Ryan owns his house outright and has $490,000 sitting in an index fund. You have $11,000 in checking and a truck that just got hooked to a flatbed in front of everyone on your street. 9 years before that morning, you were 24 years old, holding your first real job offer. $42,000 a year, benefits included, in a city where your rent was $600 a month. You did the math before you even signed. You were going to be someone who saved real money, finally. For the first 4 months, you were. $300 went into a brokerage account every payday, one you'd opened because a coworker mentioned it once at lunch. You checked the balance every few days at first, watching it climb in small, satisfying steps. It felt good. It felt like you were finally one of the adults who had it figured out, the kind of person your parents worried you might never become. Then your first raise landed. $42,000 became $49,000, and something quiet happened that nobody warns you about. Your apartment started feeling small. Not because anything about the apartment had changed, because your income had, and your brain quietly recalculated what you deserved based on what you now earned, not on what had actually made you happy 6 months earlier. You moved. Rent went from $600 to $1,100. You told yourself it was an investment in your quality of life, and in a way it was. It just wasn't the investment you thought it was. The $300 a month you'd been putting away quietly dropped to zero, and you didn't even notice the exact month it happened, because nothing about your life felt like it was getting worse. It felt like it was getting better. That's the part almost nobody tells you about lifestyle creep. It never feels like loss in the moment. It feels like a reward you earned. The cost doesn't show up as a number going down. It shows up 30 years later, as a number that never had the chance to go up. You kept telling yourself you'd start again once things settled, once the new place felt normal, once the next raise came in. By 29, you were making $71,000 a year. And the promotion came with something the offer letter never mentioned. Everyone in the new role drove nicer cars than you did. Nobody said it out loud, but you felt it every morning in the parking lot. 6 weeks after the raise hit your account, you leased a car with a payment of $580 a month. Here's the mechanic nobody explained to you at 29, and it's the one that actually decides whether you retire rich or retire anxious. Money invested in your 20s has 40 years to compound. Money invested in your 40s has 20. The exact same dollar, invested 2 decades earlier, can end up worth 4 or 5 times more, not because you did anything smarter with it, but because it simply had more time to grow. $300 a month, started at 24 and left alone, turns into something close to 7 figures by retirement. The same $300, started at 44, barely clears 6 figures. Same person, same discipline, same amount. The only difference is when it started. Ryan was still driving a car he'd bought used for $9,000. He wasn't smarter than you. He was still putting $340 a month into that same kind of fund you'd stopped touching years earlier, and every month it sat there was a month your money didn't get. The moment that should have woken you up came at your cousin's birthday dinner. Someone asked Ryan, half joking, if he was ever going to buy a nicer car. He shrugged and said he'd rather buy his 30s back later. You laughed along with everyone else. You didn't understand yet what he meant. You thought he just liked his old car. You didn't start again after that raise either. The lease payment ate the gap the same way the rent increase had eaten it before, and the account you'd opened at 24 sat exactly where you'd left it, not growing, not shrinking, just waiting for money that kept finding somewhere else to go. By your next review, you told yourself, for real this time, you'd fix it. By 32, you were making $82,000 a year, the number climbing fast enough that everyone around you kept saying you were doing great, and you believed them, because on paper, you were. That was the year you and your partner bought your first house. You didn't think of it as a decision that competed with investing. You thought of it as investing. A house was the responsible move, the grown-up move, the thing your parents had always pointed to as proof you'd made it. Nobody sat you down and explained the difference between an asset that compounds and an asset that just sits there, appreciating slowly, while eating $4,200 a month in mortgage, taxes, and the repairs nobody warns you about. Here's the mechanic that quietly worked against you the entire time. Money in a mortgage payment builds equity, but equity doesn't compound the way an index fund does, and you can't spend it without borrowing against it or selling the roof over your head. You stretched for the biggest house the bank would approve you for, because the bank said you could afford it, and the bank was measuring your income, not your future. The $300 that used to leave your account every payday for that old brokerage account had been gone for years by then. Now there wasn't even room to consider bringing it back. The moment it actually landed came 6 months in, sitting at the kitchen table with a property tax bill in one hand and a plumber's invoice in the other, doing math that didn't work no matter which way you arranged it. $1,200 for a busted water line you hadn't budgeted for. You covered it with a credit card, telling yourself you'd pay it off next month. You paid the minimum instead, for 4 months, and quietly handed the credit card company about $90 in interest for the privilege of pretending the emergency hadn't happened. You told your partner, once things stabilize, we'll start putting money away again. You meant it. By 37, you were earning $112,000 a year, more than double what you'd started with, and the mortgage felt normal, the way every unsustainable thing eventually feels normal once you stop noticing it. Then Ryan mentioned, casually, over a work lunch, that his account had crossed $300,000. He wasn't bragging. He barely seemed to think it was a big deal. You went home and couldn't stop thinking about it, running the math over and over, trying to figure out how someone making less than you for over a decade had ended up that far ahead. This is the mechanic that ends up costing people more than the lifestyle creep ever did. When you feel behind, you don't calmly start over. You panic, and panic makes people reach for shortcuts instead of time, because time is the one thing you feel like you don't have anymore. 3 weeks later, you took out a home equity line of credit for $18,000 and put almost all of it into a stock a coworker wouldn't stop talking about. The kind of tip that spreads through an office like a rumor everyone wants to believe. For 6 weeks it worked. The number in the app climbed, and for the first time in years you felt like you were catching up. You checked it before coffee, checked it during meetings, told yourself this was the year everything turned around. Then it stopped. The stock dropped 60% in a single month, and the $18,000 you'd borrowed against your house was now worth around $7,000. The loan payment was still due every month, whether the stock existed or not. You didn't tell Ryan. You didn't tell anyone. You just kept paying it, quietly, the way you'd quietly stopped investing at 25, and quietly bought the house at 32, and quietly told yourself every single time that this next stretch was temporary. It wasn't temporary. It was becoming the whole shape of your life, and it was about to get a lot more expensive before you understood exactly how much it had already cost you. By 39, you were carrying 3 separate payments every month. The mortgage, the home equity loan from the stock that didn't work out, and now a car, because after 2 years of quietly bleeding money into other people's mistakes, you decided you deserved one thing that felt good, so you financed something you couldn't really afford at $640 a month, told yourself you'd earned it, and drove it off the lot feeling, for about 3 weeks, like your old self again. The seats still smelled new. For a little while, that mattered more than it should have. Here's the mechanic that finally caught up with you, and it's the one that makes all the others so dangerous. None of these debts looked reckless on their own. Each one, by itself, was survivable. What nobody warns you about is what happens once your monthly debt payments cross roughly half of what you actually take home, because at that point, you're not just spending your income anymore, you're spending your margin, the cushion that used to exist, for exactly the kind of thing that happened next. Your hours got cut for 8 weeks during a slow stretch at work. Not fired, not a crisis, on paper, just $400 less every paycheck, for 2 months. And because you had no investments to lean on, no emergency fund, nothing left over anywhere, that $400 had nowhere to come from except the accounts that were already stretched as far as they'd go. You started missing payments in the wrong order. The credit card first, A small late fee you covered the next week without thinking much of it. Then a missed payment on the home equity loan, which came with a letter you didn't open for 4 days because you already knew what it would say. Then, finally, the car. Quietly. The way everything in your life had been happening quietly for 17 years. One reasonable decision at a time. None of them alone enough to explain how you'd ended up here. If you've ever kept paying on something long after the money for it was already gone, tell me in the comments how long you kept it a secret before anyone found out. I want to know if it was months, or if it was years, the way it was for you. You didn't tell anyone either. Not Ryan. Not your partner. Not fully. You just kept juggling, one payment ahead of disaster, for 18 more months. Right up until the morning, a man in a tow truck made the decision for you, in front of your entire street. 41 years old, standing in that driveway. You didn't cry, not right away. You watched the truck pull off, with your car chained to the back of it. Watched your neighbor finally stop pretending not to look, and went inside. You sat down at the same kitchen table where the plumber's invoice had once seemed like the worst thing that could happen to you, and for the first time in 17 years, you actually did the math all the way through, instead of looking away from it halfway. Here's what the math told you. If you had kept putting $300 a month into that first brokerage account starting at 24, and let it grow, along with even half of every raise after that, the same way Ryan had, you would have had somewhere close to $490,000 right now. Not because you would have needed to be smarter, or pick better stocks, or skip the house, or never once enjoy your own money. Just because the money would have had 41 years instead of 4 to do what money does when nobody interrupts it. Instead, you had $11,000 in checking, a repossessed car, a home equity loan you were still paying on for a stock that no longer existed in any meaningful way, and a mortgage on a house that had never once felt like the asset you'd been promised it would be. The number you actually had left, after everything, wasn't just small. It was smaller than what you'd started with at 24, once you accounted for what inflation alone had done to it while you weren't looking. The gap wasn't $479,000. It felt bigger. It felt like the gap between the person you thought you were becoming at 24 and the person doing this math at 41. Here's the thing. Almost nobody tells you about money, and it has nothing to do with stocks or spreadsheets. Every single decision you made along the way was reasonable. The apartment upgrade was reasonable. The car was reasonable. The house was reasonable. Even the risky stock, in the moment, felt like the responsible response to feeling behind. None of it was reckless. That's what makes lifestyle creep so much more dangerous than any single bad investment could ever be. A bad investment costs you money once. Lifestyle creep costs you the decades you needed that money to actually compound, one reasonable decision at a time, until you look up and the decades are simply gone. Wealth was never really about the income you earned. It was about what you protected from your own comfort. The version of you that got to keep his margin wasn't smarter than you, and he wasn't even more disciplined in any single moment you could point to. He just never let a single good year convince him he'd already arrived. He kept the gap between what he earned and what he spent wide open, year after unremarkable year, while you kept closing it, a little more, every single time life gave you a reason to. That's the real question this video is actually about. Not whether you can afford something, whether you can afford to keep being the same person after your income changes. Nobody puts that on a billboard, because it doesn't sell anything. It's not a stock tip. It's not a hack. It's the quiet, unglamorous discipline of staying as unimpressed with your own success as you were before it happened, long enough for the math to finally work in your favor instead of against it. The tow truck's taillights disappeared around the corner of your street, and your neighbor finally looked away from his window, and you were still standing in the driveway, in the exact spot where all of this had started, when you did the one thing you'd avoided doing for 17 years. You called Ryan, not to ask for money. To ask how he'd actually done it, the real version, not the version people say at parties. He told you what you already suspected sitting at that kitchen table an hour earlier. He'd never made more than you. He'd just never let his spending catch up to his income, not once, not for a single year, even when it would have been easy and completely understandable to let it. You didn't fix 17 years that week. Nobody does. But you opened a new account, the kind you'd opened once before at 24, with far more excitement, and far less understanding. And you put in the only thing you actually had left, $200. It wasn't the $490,000 you'd missed. It wasn't going to be, not for a long time, but it was the first month in 17 years where the number in that account was the same on payday as it had been the day before your raise came in. That's the whole video, really. Not a story about a bad stock, or an expensive car, or a house you stretched for. A story about the gap between what you earn and what you keep, and how quietly, reasonably, invisibly, that gap can close, raise after raise, until there's nothing left protecting you at all, when the ordinary bad luck of a normal life finally shows up at your door. So here's my question for you, and I actually want an answer in the comments. Think about your last raise. Did your spending move first, or did your investing? Be honest, because for 17 years, I wasn't. If you want to see how this plays out for the people who get it right instead of wrong, stay subscribed, because that's the entire reason this channel exists. And if you're the one still investing before you upgrade anything, good. Watch the video on your screen right now anyway. It's about the exact habit that made Ryan's version of this story possible in the first place.